So in this sense, it's unique in terms of its political symbolism, but it's also unique in terms of its delivery of services.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, better known as UNRWA, was established in 1949 to support Palestinians displaced during the first Arab-Israeli War. Today, it provides services and humanitarian relief to nearly 6 million Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and, of course, Gaza. There has always been some tension between Israel and UNRWA, but since October 7th, and the Israeli war in Gaza, Israeli leaders have sought to dismantle UNRWA. Following accusations that 12 out of UNRWA's 13,000 staff in Gaza took part in the October 7th attacks, the United States suspended funding for UNRWA, and many other key donors followed suit. This funding suspension took place even as UNRWA's humanitarian relief networks in Gaza are widely regarded as irreplaceable. To the extent that aid is reaching besieged populations in Gaza, it is UNRWA facilitating the deliveries. My guest today, Jonathan Lincoln, was a long-serving United Nations official, including from 2017 to 2021 as Senior Coordination Officer at the Jerusalem office of the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, where he worked on aid in the West Bank and Gaza. He is now the interim director of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. We kick off discussing the history of UNRWA before having a long discussion about the challenges UNRWA now faces in the wake of the war in Gaza. And just one quick plug before we start. From time to time, I like to recommend podcasts that I think Global Dispatch's listeners will enjoy. Here's one, Face Off, US v. China. It's about how the two nations, once friends, are now fierce competitors. You'll hear why things are so complicated now. The host, Jane Perletz, was Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, she talks with diplomats, spies, cultural superstars like Yo-Yo Ma, and more. You can listen to Face Off, US v. China, wherever you get your podcasts. And now here is my conversation with Jonathan Lincoln of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Jonathan, to kick off, can you explain the circumstances in which UNRWA was first created and what makes it so particularly anomalous within the UN system?
So UNRWA was created officially at the end of 1949 by the UN General Assembly, and it's created in the context of the refugee crisis that's created as a result of the first Arab-Israeli war. The numbers vary, but it's some 700 to 750,000, potentially even more. But Palestinians, part of the Arab population of what is today Israel, who are forced to flee or fled as a result of the war and found themselves in a number of different areas, crossing the border into Lebanon, into Syria, into Jordan, which of course included the West Bank at that time, and of course the Gaza Strip, which was ruled by Egypt up until 1967. So as part of the response to this crisis, the United Nations basically consolidates a number of the different humanitarian interventions that it had been supporting in support of this population on the ground in order to, at first, on an emergency basis, and in order to address the really dire conditions that these people had been facing.
So the United Nations supports humanitarian relief and development work, around the world. What makes UNRWA's work particularly unique and different in the context of other UN operations?
When you look at the history of the United Nations and you look at the various types of interventions, the sort of diplomatic toolkit, if you will, that's created after the creation of the United Nations in 1945, you see that a lot of it is really pioneered through this particular conflict. And UNRWA, in some ways, constitutes the first real humanitarian intervention on the part of this new organization, the United Nations at the time, to deal with a crisis at the time. So, given the emergency situation that these refugees were facing in 1949, the parameters of UNRWA is put in place to deal with the needs of this population, but also very conscious of the political sensitivities, I would say, or interests of those states in which this agency would be operating in. So, given the fact that UNRWA was sort of created before UNHCR, it kind of came up with a bespoke intervention to this particular crisis. And I think that the elements of the mandate that actually haven't changed that much since the initial creation of UNRWA at the end of 1945 that make UNRWA so unique. The linkage of UNRWA and UNRWA services to the continuation of this conflict, that they are going to provide services to this population until there is a solution to the conflict, of course, creates an entirely unique context within this idea of the provision of humanitarian and then later development services. Because, of course, UN agencies, UNHCR included, generally speaking, are providing services based pretty much solely on need. But this linkage to the conflict, and in particular to that status of the refugees, and also some of the provisions of the mandate that specifically reference other General Assembly resolutions that essentially are originally designed towards looking towards solving this most intractable, of course, nowadays conflict, is something that is quite unique in terms of UNRWA's existence. This reinforces the notion that these rights and the rights of the refugees in the context of this conflict in particular are protected. And then there's also another very important distinction in the sense that UNRWA actually takes on state-like services. UNRWA here, in its 5 areas of operations, which are Gaza, West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, actually provides direct services. So it has this massive ranks of staff that consist of some 30,000, 13,000 alone in a place like Gaza, by far the largest, where they are not just supporting local schools, they are the schools, they are the teachers, engineers building in areas marked as refugee camps, for example. Also, with regard to basic health services and health clinics, the doctors themselves are UNRWA staff. It's not like the way that the World Health Organization might work in terms of, deploying a group of doctors to support either a particular hospital or clinic or a Ministry of Health most often. So in this sense, it's unique in terms of its political symbolism, but it's also unique in terms of its delivery of services.
And is it fair to say that it's because of that latter unique contributions of UNRWA that it is a service delivery organization that takes on almost the trappings of a state? It does run the schools, it does run the hospitals, it does run, garbage collection, that the security establishment in Israel has tended by and large to see UNRWA more, if not a partner, just as something they're willing to tolerate and accept. Whereas the political establishment, particularly more right-wing elements, see UNRWA as a direct challenge to them politically. And there is this division within Israel between the security establishment and the political establishment and how they regard UNRWA.
I think that's correct. And I think that, one way to think about it is that most Israelis would agree that, even talking about the situation before October 7th, that UNRWA eventually has to go. The question is how, right? In the interim, while there is no conclusion of a peace process, there's no final status arrangement, which includes agreements between the Israelis and Palestinians on their borders and the status of Jerusalem, for example, and of course the status of the refugees, which is one of those sort of agreed upon final status issues. The notion is that UNRWA, in that context of an actual agreement, UNRWA comes out in the wash, right? Because then there's no need. And basically what you do is you sort of merge the new Palestinian state that is created in the context of the two-state solution with the existing internationally sponsored Palestinian welfare state, if you will, that is UNRWA, and they sort of merge, as it were, of course, with, arrangements or compensation or, whatever the final arrangement might be with regard to the populations outside of the Palestinian state, for example, those living in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. But still, that's essentially what it would mean. And indeed, I think this is what the crafters of the Oslo process essentially assumed. And it's interesting that they never made any provisions for starting to unravel UNRWA and sort of, handing over some services to this newly established entity called the Palestinian Authority, which of course is created as a result of the accords, which started in 1993. Because, of course, the assumption is that there's a 5-year interim period in which, final status would be discussed. And essentially this notion that it loses its relevance, of course, in the context of a agreed upon solution, of a two-state solution, if you will, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But of course, given the fact that we haven't seen that, of course, come to fruition, and we see the persistence of the conflict, the UNRWA services have become relied upon and actually quite vital. And so they play this sort of, interesting and, of course, extremely controversial role in the context of the relationship between the Israelis and Palestinians. And by the way, there's also a degree of tension, of course, on a very different scale and in a completely different context, but also between the Palestinian Authority and even Hamas in Gaza since 2007 and UNRWA. Because, of course, UNRWA is sort of an entity that kind of operates somewhat on a separate plane. And when you have groups like Hamas or Palestinian Authority in a more legitimate sense, of course, from, in terms of international support, trying to establish and increase its sort of engagement on the ground in, the eventuality of sovereignty and independence, to increase its control, over at the very least the areas of, heavy Palestinian population. And of course, the way that you do that is through the delivery of services.
I mean, like the way I've seen it sort of said in the international community is, better to have like a UN entity provide these services, a secular UN entity, than the kind of Islamist terrorist group doing the same and seeking to extend their control over the population. At least that seemed to be like the status quo before October 7th. And of course, October 7th happened, as did the Israeli response. And we've seen now a renewed focus on UNRWA, including a renewed impetus by the Israeli government to completely discredit UNRWA, at the same time as UNRWA is key to providing aid in Gaza during this siege. Can you just describe the unique role of UNRWA in Gaza today in terms of the provision of humanitarian assistance that does make it through?
So they also provide emergency services. So because of UNRWA's vast network, because it is so much like a state, and it works on health-related issues and also food distribution, which is one of its main services, it is in a unique position to respond to any particular emergency just by virtue of its size and its capacity on the ground. So when you think about it and think about its, the scope of its operations in Gaza, and even predating October 7th in the various rounds of war and crisis, you think back to the 2014 war, for example, UNRWA not only played a critical role during these periods of violence that we see in terms of the distribution of humanitarian aid, the coordination and delivery of humanitarian aid, but also in terms of the sort of day after and the recovery approach in terms of rebuilding, and specifically after 2014, rebuilding damage, repairing health clinics, schools, things like that. But, before we get to that, I think also in times of emergency and in times of crisis, UNRWA as the state, then its identity as the UN comes much more into focus. And then, the population look to these physical installations that have the UN flag and see them as, rightly or wrongly, depending on the case, as safe spaces and as places to take shelter. And it's there, of course, that UNRWA can provide some assistance. Of course, we're dealing with a completely different situation right now, and the sort of, historical elements of this particular conflict and the calamity facing the Palestinian people in Gaza is completely unprecedented.
So, to that end, it's in the context of UNRWA being uniquely critical to the provision of humanitarian aid, in particular, as you said, food in Gaza, that in January, the Israeli government alleged that some number of UNRWA staff, something like 13 out of 13,000 or something like that, actively participated, were criminally involved in the October 7th attacks. That sparked outrage, rightly, which in turn caused the United States to suspend funding to UNRWA and other donors as well. And the United States is the single largest funder of UNRWA by far. How has the decision by the United States to suspend aid and other countries to suspend aid, although some countries have since restored it, impacted or affected UNRWA's work, not only in Gaza, but elsewhere in the region over the last few months, to your knowledge?
So let's talk about Gaza specifically, because I think that the impact outside isn't necessarily entirely clear. But before October 7th, there's a growing sense and a general understanding, for years now, on the part of not just the United States, but other donors, that UNRWA as it is unsustainable. This notion that, you have this ever growing list of beneficiaries of, the refugees and their descendants that are, requiring these services. And, there's no way to sort of work yourself out of the job. There's no way to do that combination of sort of, humanitarian development and political, which is sort of the general accepted approach on the part of the United Nations when it comes to conflict resolution. There's nothing that you can do to sort of decrease that beneficiary load from UNRWA absent a historic resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? It's not like other refugees that are, resettled in third-party countries. They're firmly linked, and they're linked to this conflict, and they're linked to the contours, the political contours of this particular conflict. So, for a variety of reasons, both in terms of the fact that UNRWA doesn't necessarily work according to the best practices of humanitarian work across the world like others do. The same thing with its development work and its engagement on the ground. I think that a lot of the donors, and when you look at the top donors, you're talking about, yes, the United States, but also the European Union and European countries by and large. There's a growing sense that it's unsustainable moving forward. So that is where we sort of start with UNRWA, right? Never mind the sort of, deep political concerns that Israel and Israel's supporters in some parts of the United States have about UNRWA and its political symbolism. So now, when we have these allegations that not only, is UNRWA this incredibly problematic entity from a variety of perspectives, that some of which have a lot to do with Israel, some of which don't necessarily, in the sense that it's this anomaly. When we have these accusations that staff not only participated in these horrendous and brutal and sadistic attacks on October 7th, but actually even worse, that there are thousands, maybe thousand, maybe more anyway, some, they said more than 10% potentially of UNRWA staff that are not just, affiliated with Hamas in the sense that they support Hamas and they support the Hamas vision from a political perspective, but actual members, either of the armed wing, of the political wing, much more active than you might think. And this then gives, at least from the Israeli perspective, the agency a completely different character. And when you talk about Israel's the ongoing prosecution of the war, which of course is under such tremendous criticism, and a lot of it for very good reason, very justified. But then, especially when you're thinking about the day after and about what might be put on the ground in terms of some sort of governance entity, you can see the Israeli fear and the position that it can no longer tolerate this situation, which, while in the past it had lots of political and so-called existential problems with, that it ultimately benefited from, because UNRWA provided a net positive, as it were, in the absence of some sort of a solution. Now the calculation has changed considerably.
So, just to make a quick point, that we are speaking about a week before an expected report from an independent United Nations commission led by a French foreign minister that will kind of weigh the veracity and credibility of these Israeli allegations that some number of UNRWA staff were active Hamas participants. So that the conclusion of that report will obviously have, I think, significant political weight, but it, at least to me in Washington, probably won't change much, at least in the near term, for the fact that Congress has now instituted a suspension of UNRWA funding. The Biden administration said they were going to briefly suspend it pending investigation into what happened in terms of UNRWA staff on October 7th. But then Congress kind of took the ball and run with it, and in a very broad and bipartisan way have instituted in law at least a 1-year suspension of funding for UNRWA. It's hard for me to predict whether or not that funding will be restored, but it will now be certainly like a big political fight. And it seems to me that going forward, the future of U.S. funding for UNRWA is up in the air. And I'm just curious to learn from you, can UNRWA even survive without U.S. funding? And what does an UNRWA without U.S. funding look like?
Just maybe first on the Colonna report. From what we know, it's been handed to the Secretary General. There were these interim findings. And really, I think it's probably a little bit more circumscribed than what you described. I think that it's a little bit less all-encompassing in terms of their investigation. What they're actually looking at is whether or not UNRWA has the capacity to deal with these allegations of breaches of neutrality, and not necessarily, examine the scope of A, whether the Israeli intelligence is correct, or B, how many Hamas members are actually, in UNRWA, but, can UNRWA deal with it in an appropriate way? And really, this came about as a result of, after the allegations, these decisions by several countries to suspend assistance. By the way, many of those countries have since resumed their assistance just based on the ongoing humanitarian crisis and the catastrophe befalling the people of Gaza. And also, several new donors have come on board as well. So it's somewhat of a mixed picture. And the report is due on April 20th. And I think, and I wrote, in this piece in Foreign Affairs, that we shouldn't expect it to be so far reaching. And again, this is, the UN commissioned it, but it's meant to be independent, and it's led, by a former foreign minister of France and everything like that. So I'm sure it has, a degree of integrity, but I just think that its scope is somewhat narrow. So the fact that, from the UN's perspective, what it wants to do is basically say, yes, there are many problems, as we've known all along, but UNRWA has the capacity to deal with it, and here's how they should deal with it. And then, the subtext is, of course, okay, everyone that, suspended your funding, you can feel comfortable that the UN is taking this seriously. So resume your funding, because of the humanitarian emergency that's unfolding. But it's going to be harder to convince the United States, of course. And Congress's decision, it sort of effectively ignores this effort and pretty much suspends funding to UNRWA. And, at least in my reading, leaves this until the outcome of the, upcoming presidential election in November is known. So it essentially suspends the assistance up until that point. And, we'll see then what Congress looks like. We'll see who the president is, et cetera. Things might change, things might not change. But there are a couple of important caveats. One is that the United States has already transferred over $120 million of support to UNRWA. And, we hear a lot from the UN that, UNRWA is the backbone of the support to the emergency support. It is in part, but there are still other ways to support humanitarian assistance on the ground. But of course, the wisdom, as it were, of dismantling UNRWA in this context, I think, is a serious question that has, profound, implications, not just for the humanitarian situation, but from a moral perspective. But that being said, preserving UNRWA just for the sake of preserving UNRWA and the fact that it has the most trucks or it has the best capacity on the ground, over the long term, I think is a very legitimate debate that we need to have.
So, big picture, it's the day after. The dust is settled to a degree in Gaza. How does UNRWA's work change, not only in Gaza, but throughout the region? I mean, we haven't talked about it much, but UNRWA is a key service provider in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. Do you foresee that UNRWA's work there will be sort of impacted at all from the fallout of Gaza, including a reduction of U.S. support?
No, it's so hard. And just having been around other conflicts, I've never really experienced a greater lack of clarity, regarding what type of mechanisms might be put in place and what's required. And I think that one of the most important documents I think that's come out recently is the World Bank, European Union, and United Nations initial damage assessment that basically used satellite imagery, more or less, to calculate between 18 and $19 billion worth of damage to housing and infrastructure. So this brings into question what regime might be put in place, who might oversee the rebuilding, what role the United Nations might take on, and then this brings us to UNRWA, because I think that what we're going to see most likely is this multidimensional crisis, where we're going to have a significant humanitarian situation that, again, the reports of famine, of malnutrition, the lack of access to healthcare, a lot of the clinics and hospitals, as we know, have been destroyed. The access to clean water, for example, dealing with potentially outbreaks of disease and things like that. This isn't going to go away once the guns fall silent, right? In some ways, the emergency is going to metastasize and potentially get even more critical, as we move towards this sort of, humanitarian stabilization and eventually some sort of recovery phase. And I think just the scale of the damage should give us all pause. Now, UNRWA, as we mentioned, is more or less what we have in Gaza as the functional state. So an entity like UNRWA, in principle, could play an absolutely critical role. And in some ways, their role in that context might be more critical than with regard to the humanitarian assistance in some ways. And it's more easy to identify alternatives like the World Food Program and other agencies, NGOs, when it comes to the emergency humanitarian situation. It's not a full replacement necessarily, but somewhat easier to identify alternatives than when it comes to this sort of day after approach. And this is where it's going to be incredibly tricky. Because what are you going to do? Are you going to restart the schools? Are you going to, rebuild the schools, rebuild the clinics? And again, it's not like it's just serving, some 30% of the population. This is the bulk of the population. This is, between 70 and 80% of the population. And here, I think the imperative will sort of hit the ground. And I think it's there that it's vital that, in the context of a Build Back Better approach, for example, that the international community can be clear, both with the UN Secretariat in particular, UNRWA as well, on what their expectations are. And the breaches of neutrality, it's a euphemism for, Hamas infiltration, I think has a huge bearing on the day after. And I think it just sort of clarifies what the challenges are going to be once we're able to reach a sort of ceasefire situation.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.